Okay, our speaker today is Michael Sproul from Sigma Prime, which is, well, you can tell us what Sigma Prime is doing.
Yeah.
I'm sure it'll come up during the talk. Michael is actually a UNSW graduate. So he was in my theory class some years back. And he's been working specifically on a client for the Ethereum blockchain. He's probably one of the most experienced people on that particular topic. That was the topic in my sort of recorded lecture this week, talking about proof of stake protocols in general. Okay, without getting too much of the specifics of what Ethereum is doing, because other chains also use proof of stake. So we've got Michael here to tell us all about the nitty-gritty details of the Ethereum proof of stake protocol. So I'll hand over to Michael.
Great. The company I work for, Sigma Prime, is an Australian blockchain security firm primarily. So they do security assessments for projects in the crypto space. So if someone's written a smart contract and they want to make sure that it doesn't get hacked, they often will go and get a security assessment, often called an audit. And Sigma Prime specializes in auditing or assessing blockchain projects, so smart contracts and related sort of technology, so node implementations and peer-to-peer network stacks and things like this. And then we also have another half of the company that does like protocol development work, and that's what I do. So since about 2018, the company's been working on a project called Lighthouse, which is a consensus client for Ethereum. And Ethereum nowadays has about 10 clients, 5 for execution and 5 for consensus, roughly. And we're one of the 5 consensus clients. So I'll talk a bit more. Is that going to work?
Well, I wasn't plugged in just now. So
oh, here we go. This just did something.
Yes.
Okay, good. Yay. Welcome. Yeah, so Lighthouse is this Ethereum consensus client. Okay. There we go. Lighthouse is an Ethereum consensus client. It's implemented in Rust, which some of you may know. It's open source and 100% free. So you can go to GitHub and you can get all our source and you can see all the pull requests that I'm reviewing and writing and all the other people on my team are working on. And it's primarily developed by Sigma Prime. We do have external contributors and we have people that show up from time to time who get involved and submit pull requests like any open source project, but it's mostly driven by Sigma Prime. And we have about 10 or 11 full-time engineers working on it and making improvements, advancing the protocol, that sort of thing. Yeah, so Ron has already taken you guys through how proof of stake works on a general level. And I'm going to go and dig into some of the details about how it works in Ethereum specific instantiation of proof of stake. So something that I found difficult when I was learning about proof of stake is that particularly in the early days pre-Ethereum, a lot of the descriptions would be very vague about how things work and like, oh, who's going to propose a block? Like, how do we work that out? Like, what is this? What is the stake actually doing in the system? And so hopefully, if you have those questions like I had, digging into a specific protocol and seeing how it all sort of fits together might be helpful. Yeah, so as I said before, Ethereum at the moment is now split into these 2 sort of layers that have a separation of concerns. So the consensus layer is the bit that does the proof of stake protocol, and it has all of the logic for validators and stake and attestations, which we're going to get into. And then there's the execution layer, which is the sort of, it's the husk of the old Ethereum, which just does EVM execution. So EVM is the Ethereum virtual machine. It's this replicated state machine that the Ethereum world computer sort of runs on. And they have a degree of consensus that they have to come to, in that they have to agree on what the EVM computations mean, and they have a state root that they agree on. But then all of that stuff is within the context of the consensus layer. So the consensus layer kind of contains the execution layer and communicates with it. So the consensus layer is kind of in the driver's seat controlling the execution layer, and that plays out as like basically an HTTP connection between two bits of software. You have the consensus layer communicating with the execution layer and telling it, here's the latest block. Is it valid? What's the result? That sort of thing. So today we're just going to be talking about the consensus layer because that's my area of expertise. And that's where all the sort of interesting proof of stake stuff happens. Yeah. So one of the things that happened when we moved from the proof of work Ethereum to proof of stake Ethereum in 2020 was we reformed how time worked. And in distributed systems terms, we kind of added a slight timing assumption, like a synchrony assumption. But yeah, so we basically just say that time is divided up into 12-second intervals, and we more or less assume that everyone on the network is pretty much in sync by plus or minus 500 milliseconds. So one 12-second period is called a slot, and then we say that 32 slots is an epoch. And there are various things that happen in a specific slot and various things that happen on the course of an epoch. And the main thing that happens in a slot is that you might get a block. So you can have usually at most one block in a given slot on a specific chain. If there are multiple chains, like if there's forking, then you can have multiple blocks in the same slot at the same time or at similar times. But yeah, most of the time it's one, or sometimes it's zero. So if the block proposer is offline and they just miss their thing, they lose a bunch of money and there's no block for that slot. And then we just go on to the next slot and then someone can build a block. So yeah, this is what an epoch looks like. This first block of the epoch is significant, and we call that a checkpoint for reasons that I'll get into in a minute about how the consensus algorithm works. And then, so we have this concept of a validator, and it's like, what is a validator? Is it a machine? Is it a, is it a person? It's a chunk of ETH that's exactly 32 ETH. And being a validator is like a responsibility on the network. You sort of sign up to, you put your collateral down, your stake, and then you sign up to take part in the consensus protocol. And if you do your job, you get paid. And if you don't do your job, you get penalized. So the main two jobs of validators, there's a couple of others, to produce new blocks in the chain. So they replace the miners from proof of work who are producing blocks. And then also to vote on which chain is the canonical chain using these messages called attestations. And the goal of this ultimately is that we want to have a chain that has high or like strong guarantees about transaction finality. So you don't want transactions to happen and then 5 minutes later they've been reverted. So we have this concept of finalizing a transaction, which is when a sufficient number of validators have voted on it and said, yep, I've seen that, and I've seen everyone else see that, then that transaction becomes finalized, or the whole chain up to that point, including that transaction. So the block proposer is responsible for building the block, and these days they actually outsource part of the block building to another entity, but I'll go into that later. But the main job of the block proposer is to do two things. They need to select attestations to include in the block, which are the votes. So it's kind of a bit circular. There's, it's a bit inductive where, you have the block includes the attestations to the previous block. And then they also need to include a bunch of EVM transactions. And this is the part that usually gets outsourced, and we'll go into that why. But yeah, the block proposer is just a validator who's randomly selected, and they get paid proportional to the quality of attestations that they put in their block. So we'll go into exactly what that means. And also the transaction fees of the transactions that they include. So if you've got lots of high free transactions and you're the block proposer, you get to put them in and you get paid out all of those transaction fees, which is good. Although some of them also get burnt for economic reasons. I think Ron already touched on this system called RANDAO, which Ethereum uses to randomly select block proposers. And the idea behind RANDAO is that it's basically a randomness beacon that can be created in a fairly straightforward way that is decentralized. So how it works, you can see on the third line there, when we get a new block, we include this thing called a Randau signature from the proposer. And the proposer has to sign the number of the current epoch. So if the current epoch is 100, they sign 100 as the epoch, and then that gets hashed and it gets XORed. That's the little XOR equal thing there. It gets XORed into the current Randau. And the cool thing about this is that it means that the proposer basically has 1 bit of influence over this Randau value, because their signature is deterministic. If they sign the number 100, they're always going to get the same signature every time. So they have a choice just of signing or not signing. And if they sign, then they get to propose the block. But if they choose not to sign, then they miss the block. And then, so the Randau is this like value. It's a 256-bit value, and it gets used to basically shuffle all of the validators and determine the block proposers 2 epochs roughly in advance. Sometimes there's less look ahead because of complicated technical reasons, but it's mostly 2 epochs. So there's an attack here called stake grinding, which Randau is trying to prevent, but doesn't prevent entirely, which the proposer, if you're at the end of an epoch, you can influence the Randau value that's going to be used for 2 epochs time. But you only have 1 bit of influence. So you can choose between 2 alternate futures in a way. You can choose, in the future where I do propose a block now, how many blocks will I get 2 epochs down the road? Or if I choose not to propose now, will I make up for that and get more block proposals down in the future? And the more stake you have, the more effective this attack becomes, because you might have 5 blocks in a row at the end of an epoch or something. And then you would have 5 bits of influence over the future shufflings or the future proposers. So you could look at all of those 32 shufflings and say which one of these is most advantageous for me, and then take into account the penalty you pay if you're doing this dishonest thing of missing some blocks in order to get more in the future. And it turns out that you can do this attack and you can marginally increase your number of block proposals on average over time, but you can't really hijack the entire process unless you have more than 50% of stake. And if you've got 50% of stake, you can basically do whatever you want anyway. So Randau, it's not perfect, but it's pretty good, and it's stood up against the adversarial environment that Ethereum has. And so far, I think there are no plans to replace it in the near term. Yeah. Okay, and then the second part of being a validator is that you have to attest to what which chain you think is the best chain, and there's rules for determining which chain is the best that we're going to cover as well. The main idea is that you get to produce 1 attestation per epoch, so not every validator attests at the exact same time in the epoch. You get randomly assigned a slot in the epoch at which you're meant to attest. And the best case is if the block for that slot arrives, and then you attest to it, and then you gossip your attestation to the rest of the network, and then your attestation gets included in the next block. That's the like max rewards case. You get paid out the most for that outcome. And yeah, the committees are randomized again by the Randau, and this is to prevent any single committee being biased in favor of one actor. Because if you had, if someone has 15% of the stake and you accidentally assigned all of their 15% of the stake in one slot, then they suddenly have a lot of power just in that one slot, and they can use that to reorg. But because of the Randau, again, the shuffling is pretty random, and it's hard to end up with a concentration of stake in one slot, which is good for security. And so this is where it gets a bit thorny, but in Ethereum, an attestation, it's not just a signature over a single block root. So it does include that. That's called the head block vote, or the beacon block root part of the attestation. It also includes 2 other votes, or 1 other vote with 2 parts, which are the target and the source checkpoints. And this is a vote on what the checkpoint at the start of the current epoch is, and then also what the previous justified checkpoint was. So I'm going to go into what this justified checkpoint stuff is all about, but it's very similar to PBFT, the consensus algorithm, where you have 2 rounds of messaging required to agree on a value. So these source and target are forming part of the sort of longer term like consensus algorithm, and then the beacon block root, the head vote, is for the very short term fork choice part of the algorithm. And when you make a vote like this, you have to choose just one chain. So you choose a head, and then that determines your target, which is the start of the epoch, and then the source, which is whatever justification is on that chain. Before we go into the consensus stuff, I just want to mention that Ethereum has this cool crypto algorithm called BLS 12381. And the great thing about this is that it allows signatures of the same message to be aggregated into a single message that costs the same amount of time to verify as all of the aggregated messages. So you can have 10,000 signatures from 10,000 validators, and then you can have people that aggregate those and then send them to the rest of the network, and the rest of the network only has to verify one signature in order to verify the signatures of all those 10,000, which is cool. And because we're doing this thing where we cut up the epoch into slices of 32, the attesters are often agreeing on what their attestation will be. So they have signed the same message, you can aggregate them. And that's great. And this is how Ethereum has this like insanely high 1 million validator count, whereas most proof of stake networks that were created sort of prior to Ethereum usually cap out at about 100 or so validators, or maybe 200 or something, because of the complexity of sending all these network messages. So Ethereum's able to do this thing where basically everyone in the same slot or in the same committee in the same slot will gossip their attestations amongst themselves and then produce a couple of like best candidates for the with like aggregated attestations with the most votes, and then just those attestations have to be verified by the whole network. So it's a real efficiency mechanism. It saves a lot of bandwidth, saves a lot of compute, and that's how we can get away with having 1 million validators, although it does have other downsides. Yeah, so this is kind of what I was hinting at before. Ethereum really has 2 consensus protocols sticky taped together. We have one that is dealing with finalization, and this is called Casper FFG. And then we have one that is dealing with fork choice, which is, in the unfinalized portion of the chain, there might be lots of forks, there's stuff flying around. How do you choose what the head should be based on all of that information? Whereas in the finalized world, once a block has enough votes, it has 2 rounds of messaging, and everyone has agreed that this is what the chain should be, then there is only one chain. And that is kind of an interesting paradigm that we have set up there, where we have these 2 algorithms and they sort of feed into each other. So we're going to talk about fork choice first. Oh no, actually, I'll just briefly say, so did you cover the CAP theorem at all? Okay, in distributed systems, there's a thing called the CAP theorem, which is like you can have consistency, availability, or partition tolerance. You can have 2 of 3, but not all 3. And so what most systems do is that they will usually drop availability. So the finality gadget has consistency and partition tolerance, because you basically have to choose partition tolerance. You can't just say, oh, my thing's going to break if there's no partition. I mean, if there is a partition. But it might stall. So availability is sort of like a liveness thing. It's like, okay, well, the system stops processing transactions and stops being available at the point where something goes wrong, where there's a network partition. But fork choice makes the opposite trade-off, or makes a different trade-off, where it chooses to forego consistency in favor of availability and partition tolerance. So the hybrid consensus system is kind of good in that we can have, if there's a network partition or something strange going on, validators have gone offline, something like this, then finality will stop. So finality is no longer available, but validators will still produce the chain, and they'll still keep building blocks, and the fork choice algorithm will keep choosing which of those chains should be the canonical chain, but with the caveat that if another block shows up or another chain shows up that's better than the current one, then fork choice will flip-flop to that chain and you'll get a big reorg. And at the moment, one of the Ethereum testnets is like in this state where it hasn't finalized for 3 weeks. And that thing is the absolute Wild West. Like there's reorgs happening all over the place and it's kind of a bit of a mess. And it's because nobody's paying attention to it anymore. It's a deprecated testnet. There's no money at stake. So people are just basically not paying attention. Yeah, so that's kind of the trade-off between the two systems. And it gives us quite a lot of flexibility by having this sort of hybrid thing. It's better than just stalling completely when the finality would stop in Ethereum. Yeah. Okay, so fork choice is this available part of the chain. So this is when there's forking and stuff going on. The algorithm that Ethereum uses is called LMD Ghost, which is latest message-driven greedy heaviest observed subtree, which is a real mouthful, but the basic idea is quite straightforward. It's that each validator, when they attest, they contribute their balance to that chain that they are attesting to. And then the fork choice algorithm just looks at the subtree that has the most votes. So at each junction in the tree, it says, okay, which tree has the most votes in this subtree, and then does that recursively until it gets to a leaf, and then it chooses the heaviest leaf. So it's basically just trying to choose the leaf that has the most attestations on it, but with this property that attestations on this sort of subtree can reinforce each other against attestations on a different subtree. So we can look at an example of that. Here, the square things are the blocks, and the little capital B's are the weights of the attestations on that block specifically. And then we get this cumulative effect where we sum up the values from the leaves onto the edges, which are the W6. So the W6 is going to be the same as B6, but W3 is going to be the sum of W5 and W6, and also the attestations that are for 3 itself. And you can see an example of this with actual numbers here. In this case, we've got, say, 10 validators attesting to G, 25 attesting to E, 20 attesting to F, and then a couple more attesting to the older blocks. So the head is going to be one of these leaves, either G, E, or F. And it happens that the one with the most weight is also the one that LMD Ghost will choose, which happens a lot. But you can see we've got 25 and 20 is 45. Plus the 15 of C means that that subtree has a weight of 60, whereas the top tree has 10, 10, and 20, which is 40. So we've got to go to the bottom subtree, and then when we have to choose between E and F, we choose E because it has 25 rather than 20. So that is Ethereum's fork choice in a nutshell. And the starting point here is the finalized checkpoint that we already have from the other algorithm. So this is the other algorithm, Casper FFG. This is what determines what the finalized checkpoint is. And to be finalized means that the chain will not revert that block unless more than 1/3 of the validators are malicious. And basically when this happens, that 1/3 of validators that are malicious will get punished brutally for their like misbehavior. And so the input to Casper FFG are the target and source checkpoints. So we do this because we want to get finality on the course of, say, an epoch, and we want all the votes to be agreeing to the same thing. So we don't use the head vote, which might vary throughout the epoch for the different blocks. We use just the votes on the starting block of the epoch. So it's kind of like this superimposed slow motion consensus algorithm over the faster, more available fork choice consensus that's happening on a slot basis.
When you say 1/3 of validators, is that what time?
So
the original validators who signed that block, or were around at that time, or that are around currently?
Yeah, so that's a good point. It is 1/3 of the validators that were around at that time and signed that block. And that links into a thing called weak subjectivity that we're going to talk about in a minute. But yeah, because yeah, obviously validators can come and go and balances can go up and down and things. And it's not just 1/3 of validators by count, but it's by balance. So you sum up all the balances of the validators, and 1/3 of that balance would have to be malicious in order to revert finality. Yeah. And so, yeah, Casper FFG is similar to this classical Byzantine fault tolerance algorithm called PBFT. And it's just based on the same idea of sort of 2 rounds of messaging where you have, you say, I saw this block, and then everyone votes and say, I saw everyone else see this block, and then that means the block is confirmed as finalized. And we kind of draw these diagrams where we say that, you're voting from your source to a target, and you draw this like edge in the block graph that says, okay, there's 2/3 of weight along this edge, and then there's maybe 2/3 of weight along another edge, and you go from there. That's what I mean by the weight. So you can see here that checkpoint n for epoch n is going to be finalized because we have an edge, which is a bunch of votes of 2/3 of the balance from checkpoint n as the source to checkpoint n plus 1 as the target. And that probably means that we are at the end of epoch n plus 1, or maybe at the start of epoch n plus 2 when this happens, because we've seen all of the attestations from epoch n plus 1, and they've all voted and said, yeah, okay, the previous justified thing was n, and we're going to vote to make n plus 1 the new justified thing, and to make n our finalized thing. So there's this kind of like 2 epoch lag where usually in epoch n plus 2, epoch n is finalized, and epoch n plus 1 is going to be justified, if everything's sort of running smoothly and everyone's attesting and agreeing on the same chain. Cool. Now, the problem with this is validators are free to just sign, well, if we didn't have another rule here, validators could be just free to sign whatever messages they want, and they might just say multiple chains, and they might say, oh, well, I'm just going to sign all of them because that way I get paid no matter what, right? If my attestation gets included on this chain, then I'll get paid, and if it gets included on the other one, then I'll also get paid. And that would be really bad because it would mean that we could have multiple finalized chains getting lots of votes, and that's not what we want. We want to just have one finalized chain, and we want to have that property that if there are multiple finalized chains, then the validators must have been malicious, and we can punish them. So this is called the nothing at stake problem, and like some proof of work people think that this is a big deal, but it's actually really easy to solve. You basically just say that there is a huge financial penalty for breaking these slashing rules, slashing conditions that we put in the protocol. And that's what Ethereum does. We have a couple of slashing conditions that basically just say, do not vote on multiple chains. So one of the rules, the most straightforward probably, is that you can't, if you're the block proposer, only propose one block or you're getting slashed. So if it's your responsibility to propose at slot N and you produce 2 blocks, then anyone else on the network can take those 2 block headers and submit that as evidence of your misbehavior, and then you lose part of your balance. Yeah. By default, you only lose 1 ETH, but if there's a correlated attack where lots of people are doing this, then the penalty increases really quickly to the point where you lose your whole balance. So if you try and attack Ethereum with about 1/3 of the validators, you're going to lose all of your money. The other rule is no double voting with attestations. So it's slashable to produce 2 attestations in the same epoch that are not identical. So if you vote for block A and block B that are even just on the same chain but at different slots, you're done. Like you get slashed, game over. Your validator gets kicked out. And then there's this other concept called a surround attestation, which I'll show a diagram of to explain in a sec. So this is probably the most common way that someone might try and do a double vote attestation. We're here in epoch 3, and there's 2 chains that are competing. And we know that justification is here in epoch 0. So we're going to cast the vote with that as the source, but then 2 different targets. So we're going to say, oh, we're going to support this chain here, but we're also going to support this chain here. And then again, anyone can see those 2 messages and construct a proof that says, look, this guy signed 2 things that are conflicting, and then they get slashed. The surround vote is a little bit more subtle. but this turns out to be necessary for some parts of the proof. But basically, it's just saying that you're not allowed to forget about a justification that you claim to have seen. Because when you make a vote like this, and you say, okay, I saw this justification, and I'm voting for this as the new justification, you're saying that I saw this, and I agree that this is the canonical chain. So you can't later say, well, actually, I think this is the latest justification, and I'm going to vote for something newer that dissents from that rather than dissenting from this. So this surround case where you have the one vote is like completely encompassing the other vote is illegal, and then you also get slashed if you do this. And it doesn't matter which order you do this in either. If you publish one to the network first and then the other, people can just collect that evidence and then use it against you, and you get slashed. So, and this prevents the protocol from reverting finality unless 1/3 of people do this and misbehave. So that property we call economic finality or accountable safety. And it basically says that in order to get 2 finalized checkpoints, and you can prove this, there's a proof in the book that I'm going to link at the end. You need 2/3 of validators to vote for both. So that means you've got 4/3 of validators total voting on 2 chains, which means there must be a 1/3 overlap between those 2 sets. And then you know that 1/3 are going to be slashable because they must have. You can prove that they must have violated the slashing condition in order to be able to vote on both chains. And that's great. That means that basically attacking Ethereum like this is just not a rational thing to do. You're just going to burn money, and you're not going to reorg the chain. You're just going to get wrecked, and then it's going to be a sad time for you. And the network is safe. You don't get paid out like you would for reorging some other chains. Like if you have more hash power in Bitcoin and you overtake the canonical chain and do a massive reorg, you get all of the block rewards for that reorg, and you get everyone's transaction fees and everything, and you can rewrite history and you get paid for it, and like the expected value is positive. Here, if you do a reorg, expected value is negative because the network just sticks with the original finalized checkpoint that it saw, and your attack chain is just going to get thrown in the bin, and you're going to lose all your money on both chains regardless of which one becomes canonical. And in the case where validators aren't malicious, then we have the same properties as a regular Byzantine fault-tolerant algorithm, which is just that so long as less than 1/3 are malicious, then finalized stuff does not get reverted. Okay, before we jump in any further, does anyone have any questions about the Casper FFG or the fork choice stuff? Yeah.
Are there situations where recovery is not possible? So I understand that the Casper FFG fail if you have the 1/3 or more malicious validators.
Yeah.
But for example, if you have a majority of faulty validators, could the chain recover by itself anyway?
Yeah, so there's a mechanism by which it can, which is what I'm about to cover. But usually, yeah, if we hit that threshold of half the validators being malicious, usually there'll have to be some manual intervention, pretty much to just say, as a community of node operators, we're going to choose to follow one finalized chain over the other. So so how it works in Lighthouse is once we've seen one finalized chain, we will refuse to reorg to another finalized chain. So in that sense, if we saw the attacker's chain first and the rest of the network continues on the other chain, then your node is going to be stuck until you say, hey, delete your database and go and reseek to the proper finalized chain. But so far, this has never happened in Ethereum, not even on a testnet, I don't think. Although, no, we do test it on testnets, but no one's ever attacked Ethereum like this. But yeah, if they did, it would be a matter of manual intervention rather than Casper FFG recovering itself. Yeah. Any other questions? Okay, cool. Yeah, so thinking about like disaster scenarios, there's a case here where we might want to recover, which is if a bunch of the validators all suddenly disappear and we lose our ability to have a 2/3 threshold to finalize and justify, how do we recover? Like, what do we do? So Ethereum has this system called the inactivity leak, which kicks in as soon as finality stops. Basically, anyone who is not voting, anyone who seems to be offline, starts to leak their balance, and they leak at a quadratic rate. So it starts out pretty slow, and then it just gets faster and faster and faster and faster until those validators, after about 2 weeks, or depending on how many people are offline, after about 2 weeks, usually they have no money left, and then the validators that are left online will comprise 2/3 again. So you can imagine if you just, if Ethereum just dipped below the 2/3 threshold, if it was at 66% exactly, it would start leaking the people that are not online until the people that were online comprised more than 2/3 again, and then bang, finality would happen again, and everything's okay. The corollary of this, though, is that thing I said before about the cap theorem is not entirely accurate, because you can actually get conflicting finalized chains without anyone misbehaving and being slashed. Because if you have a network partition and both sides of the partition are leaking out the validators from the other side, then they will both finalize different chains on either side of the partition. So this is, imagine like someone cuts a deep sea cable between like the southern hemisphere and the northern hemisphere. So there's northern hemisphere Ethereum and southern hemisphere Ethereum. And that goes on for 2 weeks, and then they both finalize. And then at that point, you're basically in the situation same as if someone had attacked the network and created a conflicting finalized checkpoint, where you have to choose one of the chains to become canonical, and it requires like a manual intervention at that point. But so far, this has also never happened where we've gotten 2 finalized chains. What has happened, I think at least once, maybe twice on Ethereum mainnet in the last 4 years, is that there was a bug in a bit of software that caused a bunch of validators to get knocked offline, and then the inactivity like kicked in and started penalizing them. But it only did it for a couple of hours before the bug was fixed, and then everyone was back online, and then no harm done. It's just like some people lost a bit of money for running buggy software. It wasn't our software, just to be clear. Yeah, that's the inactivity leg. So that's it's kind of a contentious one, because it kind of has strange behavior in network partition, but then again, it's quite practical so long as you're willing to rely on this social consensus to a degree. So that probability that I was talking about it's called weak subjectivity, and it means that if you see 2 chains that are both finalized and both appear to be valid, you can't necessarily know which one is the canonical proper Ethereum chain without some external information from the community or someone that you trust. Or if you're running your node for the whole time, then you have your own opinion of what you think the finalized chain is. But if the rest of the community says, no, actually, we're going to change what the finalized chain is to this other one when they conflict, then you need that external information to know which chain is valid. And weak subjectivity, this is a controversial opinion, but Vitalik came up with this term. He's the guy that created Ethereum. And he says that Bitcoin does not have weak subjectivity, whereas Ethereum does with proof of stake. But I would say that Bitcoin actually does also have weak subjectivity, because it would still rely on social consensus if there were a big reorg. Like if you imagine the NSA have some vastly better hash pool than the rest of the world, and they go and mine a Bitcoin chain that just reorgs out the last 3 years. So the last 3 years of Bitcoin never happened, and the NSA just has complete control, and they publish their chain to the network. What Bitcoin clients should do to follow the protocol is just reorg to that chain, because it has more hash power. But that's obviously not what anyone would want to do. Like they would be reverting that ASAP if that happened. So it's a similar thing in Ethereum. If there's a massive attack, then the community is going to say, no, okay, we reject the attack. We're going to stick with the original finalized chain. So yeah, that's a bit of personal opinion. I think maybe there's something in the definition of weak subjectivity that rules out Bitcoin being weak subjective, but it's basically weak subjective because of the social consensus element.
There any software that says that this sort of multiple chain finalized chain situation only arises in the case of repetition, or situations where?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. Yeah, so the Casper FFG proof says it only happens if there's a slashing, But then, yeah, I haven't seen a proof that says that the inactivity leak only creates is the only thing that can create two conflicting finalized chains outside of that. I suspect there is a proof somewhere, but I'm not familiar with it. But intuitively, it sort of makes sense that, yeah, it's only going to happen if there's a partition, because otherwise, or like it could be a bug, right? That some client chooses not to import blocks produced by another client, and then you have a fork that way. One bug that we have here, yeah.
So that's very interesting. Yeah, so the partition can be essentially the result of some bugging sometimes. Right?
Yes, yeah.
So there should be we should be extremely careful about the type of clients that exist in the network.
Yes, exactly. And actually, that's something where we have to devote a lot of energy sort of outside the protocol to making sure that people run a diverse mix of clients, because the really bad threshold would be if one client had 2/3 of the network share, then they could just finalize their own invalid chain. And then the rest of the network would be going, hey, you guys are on an invalid chain, but it would be finalized. And then all of those validators would basically have to get slashed in order to go back to the non-buggy chain. So that's really bad. On the consensus layer, we don't have any client that's larger than 2/3. So that's good. Lighthouse is the second largest at like 33%. So we're larger than a third, which means if there were a bug in Lighthouse, it could cause a liveness failure, but it's not going to cause two conflicting finalized chains. And yeah, but on the execution side, the main Ethereum client is Geth, which is the most stable, the most established, and it does have about 80% of the share. So if there were a bug in Geth, and then all of the validators using Geth attested to the buggy block, that chain would be finalized, and all of those validators would either be asking for a bailout to get everyone to follow the Geth bug, or they would be getting slashed as they're forced to sign a surrounding attestation to switch back to the proper chain. And my position is that we shouldn't bail out. Yeah, we shouldn't canonicalize bugs in that case. So yeah, I would just be supporting those validators getting slashed. And there's a lot of like sort of politicking on Twitter about trying to educate people who are running validators that you are putting all of your money at risk if you run Geth, but they still not listening. So I don't know really what the solution is there. Maybe we have to see it happen for them to learn. But yeah, my validator I run Lighthouse, which is maybe a bit dicey because it's 1/3 of the network. But then I run this like obscure Rust execution client called Reth, which has less than 1% of the network using it. So I'm not going to get slashed. Although I might go offline because of other bugs. Yeah, speaking of bugs, okay, yeah, this might be the last thing we have time for. We've got to finish in 10. Yeah. This was a bug that was pretty juicy that actually occurred on an Ethereum testnet before anyone had found it analytically. So we saw this thing happen and we were like, what is going on here? This really should not happen. And it was due to a subtle interaction between the two consensus algorithms that we've sticky taped together. So there's this sort of circular problem where LND Ghost depends on the output of Casper FFG, and Casper FFG determines what the finalized chain is based on the output of LND Ghost. So they're both kind of looking at each other. And the problem comes about when this is actually like real Ethereum data from the Goalie testnet, but we saw this reorg happen where on this chain, which was initially canonical, we just thought there was a couple of skips at the start of that epoch, and then the chain sort of continued as normal for the rest of the epoch and made this chain of 30 blocks, and there's transactions and attestations, and all the validators agreed that this was the head. And then this weird thing happened when we got to the start of the next epoch. Suddenly, the chain reorged to this really old block from back here, which had not been seen by any of these validators initially. It had come out late. It had maybe come out like here, but for the entirety of this epoch, forkshoks had been saying, this is the head, this is the head, this is the head. Do not reorg to this. But then as soon as we got to the epoch boundary, it reorged this universally everywhere on every node and wiped out like 30 blocks worth of transaction history. And a lot of people were freaking out about this because, you know, although finalization takes 2 epochs, people tend to think, oh, my transaction is confirmed after it has been, you know, it has 5 block confirmations or 7 block confirmations, which is how it works in proof of work. So this was quite a bad property that we failed to uphold here in the consensus algorithm. And the reason that happened is because of this interaction between Casper FFG and fork choice. And what happened was this block, the one that reorged the chain, it had attestations in it that were sufficient to justify this epoch 192, 87, and 8. So there are attestations in this block that justify this and make this the best justified epoch. Whereas on this chain, they didn't have the attestations from that 28 block. And there actually used to be an expiry on attestations where they could only be included for up to 32 slots. So we would sometimes see it happen that even if the attestations were known on this chain, they couldn't be included because they were too old. And then what happened at the end of the epoch is that we actually calculated, you know, for all of the chains, like what is the justified checkpoint of that chain, and then we updated fork choice's view of what justification was. And when that happened, it basically said, oh, well, 78 is justified, and only things that agree with 78 being justified are valid. So we only have one choice ahead, and it is this block. And this whole chain was deemed inferior because it didn't have justification that was competitive with the other chain. And the fix that we applied for this, and this was a whole process, we had to sort of develop it, test it, fuzz it, release it, all in secret without revealing that this was what the vulnerability was. The fix was that we had to basically, whenever a block comes in, you calculate what its justification and finalization would be at the end of the epoch, and you use that information to inform what the head is. And what that prevents this really long reorg here, where basically if 28, 27, or 28, 29 came out at a similar time, you would calculate the justification for both of them at that time, and you would see that, oh, 28 is better, and then you would spend the rest of this epoch building on 28 and not have this situation where you build on a chain and then suddenly get blindsided by 28 coming out of nowhere and reorging you. So since that fix went live, all of our fuzzers have not found any like long block reorgs. I wrote a fuzzer that would like basically just brute force throwing blocks into the chain at different timings and with different numbers of votes, trying to get long reorgs. And the longest reorg that you see with that and like a moderate amount of stake attacking on that side chain is like 3 blocks maybe, or 2 blocks most of the time. So no more 30 block reorgs, thankfully. But that was quite scary to deal with when it happened, and a bit stressful to patch. It took like weeks or months to patch that because it was a matter of diagnosing what was wrong and then developing the fix. People were proposing different fixes, and some of the fixes that people came up with were actually themselves broken, and we had to really like refine exactly, okay, at what point do you calculate justification? How do you calculate it for the different chains? And how does that work? But it works now, mostly, hopefully. Okay. I think I might actually be out of time, or
yeah, I don't think it's another class coming in session. So
okay.
That's like a few more minutes.
Okay. Yeah, I ended up going slower than I thought, but I'll tell you briefly about the latest upgrade that Ethereum did, which is something that Ron asked that I put in, and this is about layer 2. So the ultimate aim of Ethereum is to scale and to be able to take on more users, run more transactions, and do more stuff more efficiently. And there's 2 approaches to scaling. There's like basically just more blocks, more transactions, more state growth, and just force the network to deal with it. And this works to a certain degree because of Moore's law and computers getting faster and everything. But it would be better if we could do sharding, which is where we break up the state and the transactions and split responsibilities for different parts of the state to different nodes or different validators. And if we can achieve sharding, then that is better than just having base layer scaling, because then we still get base layer scaling, but we get it like multiplied by the effect of the sharding that is in the system. And then so the approach that Ethereum is taking is this layer 2 chain-driven approach, where you basically have these other chains that are called layer 2 chains, which are secured by Ethereum's consensus. So unlike some forms of side chains, these layer 2 chains, if they're well designed, end up having the same degree of security as the base chain that they're built on. And most of the L2 chains that we see are things called rollups, which are basically just mini copies of Ethereum running in parallel with the main Ethereum. And then they post their batches of transactions as data on Ethereum every now and then to just say, okay, this is everything that's happened on the L2 in the last little while. But Ethereum, don't worry about executing it. We're just telling you that it happened. One of the most popular types of rollups is an optimistic rollup. And this basically just posts lots of transactions onto the layer 1. And then only in the case where there's a dispute about how those transactions should be executed, does the layer 1 have to get involved in settling a dispute on the layer 2. So you can think of it like the layer 1 is mostly just being used for data storage. And then if there's a dispute, then the layer 1 smart contract has to resolve that dispute and say, okay, no, actually the canonical head or the canonical state of the layer 2 chain is this thing, and there's a cryptographic proof that shows that. The advantage of this is that most of the layer 2 transactions don't need to be executed on layer 1. It's only when there's a dispute, which should be rare. And also you get to inherit the finality of the Ethereum chain or the layer 1 that you're building on. The problem is, though, that you need to wait for this sort of challenge period to elapse after you submit a transaction on layer 2 to make sure that someone's not going to fly in and submit a fraud proof that reverts it. And the challenge period is something like 2 weeks or 3 weeks, usually for most optimistic rollups. This is also zero knowledge rollups, but I'm going to skip them because we're running low on time. Basically, what we added to Ethereum on the 13th of March was a feature specifically for rollups. And how this feature works is we gave the rollups temporary data storage that they can use to share data amongst all their nodes and come to consensus on what the layer 2 data is, but without that data needing to be accessible to the EVM, and also without that data needing to be kept forever. So previously, they were putting all of their layer 2 data into Ethereum smart contract call data, which is like the arguments that you pass into a smart contract. And that's really expensive because that data gets stored by every Ethereum node forever at the moment. Whereas the blobs only get stored for 18 days, and only in the case of a dispute or something does the layer 2 have to reveal the full blob data on layer 1 and then process it using the same dispute resolution mechanism that they would process it with previously. So we now have this system where there's up to about 6 times 128, about a megabyte of blob data flying around every block. And this has greatly increased the throughput for these layer 2 systems because they are just, there's heaps of layer 2s and they're all just throwing data into these blobs. And then after 2 weeks, my node that I'm running at home gets to delete that and they get to keep it if they want. But yeah, they basically achieve a similar security guarantee to what they had before, but without clogging up Ethereum. And that saves them money and saves us resources. Yeah, I think I've got to stop there because I'm out of time. But I can. Huh?
Yeah.
I've got a bunch of further reading here. If you want to dig into Ethereum more, there's research forums, there's books, there's our code that you can go and look at. A lot of the diagrams that I used were from Ben Edgington's book, Upgrading Ethereum. If you want to dig into how Ethereum works, particularly the consensus layer, that's the best resource by far. Thank you very much. I guess questions, or you guys probably want to get out of here. Yeah. Yes. Okay, so we just didn't publicly, like, we do all our work on GitHub. So we just didn't make an issue in the issue tracker that was like, oh, there's a bug here, and if someone exploits it, then they can cause these massive reorgs and break the chain. So everyone in my company knew about the bug, and then we were communicating with people from other companies like Ethereum core developers. There's about 160 Ethereum core developers. So it was kind of this like open secret amongst us, but we just tried not to put it on like crypto Twitter. And then people on crypto Twitter were like wildly speculating about what the bug was, and they were like, the whole system's broken and blah blah blah. This shows why proof of stake doesn't work. And we were like, just please, just relax for a little while. But eventually we got there and we released the fix, and then it was fine. So no one actually exploited it on the main network. It just happened by accident on testnets. Yeah. Yeah.
Lighthouse. So Casper FFT.
So yeah, so Lighthouse is it's an implementation of the protocol. So it implements all of the rules for validating blocks and creating attestations. So if you want to run a validator, you can run Lighthouse, and it will like automatically produce those attestations for you. It'll make sure that you don't get slashed, and it will keep your execution client in sync with what the chain is and what the latest transactions are. So yeah, it's like, I don't know, it's probably 100,000 lines of Rust at this point, because there's lots of networking stuff that goes on, lots of, yeah. Yeah. So there's, most of them are in different programming languages, and they have different, I guess they have different priorities. Like some are good at archiving data. So if you want to look at the history of the chain, then some clients will excel at doing that. Others are really fast at like validating a block and then attesting to it, which is obviously a good property to have. Although the fastest client, pardon me, is one that's implemented in Java, and for some strange reason, not many people use it. I think it's the third most popular at about 17% or 15%. Yeah, others will like run on, there's one called Nimbus that runs on like really low end hardware. So you can run it on a Raspberry Pi, and it tries not to use too much memory, unlike the Java client. And yeah, it's basically just a way of encouraging diversity in implementation in case there's a bug, and then also allowing each client to sort of carve out its own niche. So yeah. Cool.
So you said something like a million validators.
Yes.
Right, which is a large number, but it's not sort of Satoshi's vision of everybody being a validator.
Yeah. So
and the stake required to be a validator is fairly high.
It is. So it's 32 ETH, which at the moment is $150,000 or something, which is a lot. Back in 2020, it was a lot less, which is when we launched the chain. And yeah, the million number is kind of, it gives an artificially positive impression of how diverse Ethereum's validators are. In reality, there are a couple of entities that control probably close to 30% of those validators. So they have hundreds of thousands of keys that are individual validators, but then they're just running 20,000 keys per machine in a data center somewhere. So something that I wanted to cover was that we're planning to introduce a mechanism where these large validators can consolidate their balance, and then Ethereum's validator count will be a little bit more representative of how many validators, how many individual entities there actually are. And that protocol upgrade will probably go through in the next year or so. And then we'll probably only have, after that, we might have 100,000 validators or 50,000 or something. And that's probably still an overestimate of how many unique entities there are, but it's a bit better. So there's a question back there. Oh yeah, so this was sort of, it was based on the dispute period that the roll-ups use. So the roll-up will only allow a fraud proof to be submitted within, say, 2 weeks. And then the 18 days gives them a couple of extra days worth of sort of slack and leeway to keep that data available. But yeah, it does mean that if you want to sync a roll-up, you can't get the blobs older than 18 days, so you need some sort of snapshot to sync to the rollup network, and then you can keep following it from that point on. So yeah, that's kind of how it goes. Yeah. What kind of wish? Oh, for a ZK rollup. So I think usually a ZK rollup will put a state diff in there, and then they'll put a zero knowledge proof that says that whatever the previous state was, with that state diff applied, now becomes the new state root. So the Ethereum chain, like previously when everything was in call data, the Ethereum smart contract would like verify the zero knowledge proof that says, okay, here's the update. When I apply the update, this is what I get. But it wouldn't actually apply that update. It would just verify proof of that update's like execution. Yeah, they do. Although they need to do. I was reading about this and prep for this talk. Actually, I've got a slide on. Where did it go? This. They have to do this thing where they prove they can get a blob commitment. So they can't get the whole blob data in the EVM, but they can get it's a KZG commitment, cryptographic commitment to what the blob data is. And then they can have their zero knowledge proof, which has a zero knowledge commitment using some other scheme to the same data, and then they can prove equivalence between those. So even though they can't see the blob data directly, they can have a proof that says, okay, the commitment that I see in the block is equivalent to the commitment that I have in the zero knowledge proof, and therefore the blob is the same data that I'm doing the proof over. So they, as of a month ago, March 13, the ZK rollups that exist have moved over to using blobs on Ethereum mainnet, which is cool. Okay, any other questions? Okay, thank you for having me.
Thanks again.